Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's session, the fourth in our series of sessions that Mills and Reeve and RSK have been doing jointly for our Brownfield clients and the sector more broadly. This is the fourth in the series. We've had some really interesting sessions so far. Hopefully, many of you that are on the call today will have joined us previously to see Ben Duval from the Fiscal Incentives Group talking about land remediation relief. Duncan Spencer gave a really interesting session there on environmental insurance from EDIA, and Tom Henman and John Davies from RSK talking about natural capital thinking and the strategy around how brownfield developers can incorporate things like biodiversity, net gain into their plans for future development. And I'm really glad to say that today we're able to kind of close out the series with Keith Davidson from Mills and Reeve. Details there on the screen for you in terms of our LinkedIn profiles if you want to get in touch. As I say, it's my pleasure to introduce Keith to talk around hints and tips around brownfield development and contaminated land. And Keith and I have worked on many projects over the years on various different transactions and contaminated land related projects. Keith will be known to many of you in the Manchester area and known in various legal directories as a heavyweight in contaminated land terms. So it's just before we move on to the actual session, Keith, if we could nudge the slides on a little bit. We just got a little bit of housekeeping to go into today. The session is being recorded. Just so that you're aware of that, and that recording will be sent out to delegates after the session for you there. But if you have any questions at all, please put them in the Q&A box. I'll be looking to gather those questions later to kind of interview Keith. If we run out of time at the end, it is only 30 minutes. If we do run out of time, we will come back to you with some answers following the session. But again, if any issues that you have, please email Sarah on the screen there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Keith. And if you'd like to take the lead, please.
Thank you very much, Warren. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the really good turnout. Environmental liability transfer is a well-established topic with American lawyers and the environmental insurance sector, but I think it should be used more here because it's all about who pays for contaminated land liabilities. Now, this can be achieved by a combination of mechanisms, correctly using the statutory exclusion tests, etc., which I'll explain. Negotiating a robust commercial contractual indemnity. Now that can often not be achieved, which then points to a very important extra layer of protection, which is environmental insurance, where basically most of the liabilities gets passed to an insurance company at a premium. Now, it's important that all of that is coordinated by your environmental lawyer, but for extra control and authority in negotiations, it's very important to have the best technical advice. So, although this will be billed for 30 minutes, I've asked Warren to add some slides on the technical tips and pitfalls for developers. So we will probably run over by 5 or 10 minutes. Now, I have lost count the number of times in transactions where somebody tries to explain the whole topic as the polluter pays. Well, the polluter doesn't pay generally with contaminated land liabilities. The first reason for this is really common sense. If you have contamination from 50 or 100 years ago, they probably no longer exist. But there have been two important cases that increase the risks for developers. The National Grid Environment Agency case basically said that National Grid were off the hook for pollution caused by predecessor gas companies. That's maybe 100 or more years of pollution. Then in the Powers County Council Price case, a local authority was not liable for a predecessor local authority that had basically dumped all the waste in the landfill. So that's a get out of jail card for basically two very high risk areas, gas works and landfills. But the first half of this talk will really be on the third bit. That's a headache for developers. Basically, with the statutory exclusion tests and agreement on liabilities, the polluter or the knowing permitter can get off the hook and pass all that liability across. So as I say, it's the developer most at risk, not the polluter. Now, to understand liability transfer, you first have to understand what the environmental liabilities are. Now, I won't go into this slide in detail, obviously, but developers would be primarily focused on the two pink bits, which is remediation via planning and cleaning up to a standard where the land is no longer contaminated land standards. But for high risk sites, you're bringing in the purple bits as well. All these pollution, water pollution regimes can bring in criminal liability, personal liability, and of course, civil claims. But the real purpose of this slide is to highlight the third column, which is contractual liabilities, because this often goes under the radar. Has a lease got an indemnity? Is there a previous indemnity in a sale contract? Is there a deed of covenant that means the indemnity must be given by future parties? That liability often needs the best type of insurance, which is the more expensive insurance. So your legal due diligence needs to pick up on that. Now, probably the best case to explain environmental liabilities is the Sandridge case, Crest Nicholson. Now, as you can see with this slide, it's not just pollution on the site you're worried about. Groundwater pollution, which is bromate, pollution in a chalk aquifer migrated 20 kilometers. And quite a lot of parties involved in the resulting argy-bargy. Now, the other thing about this case is both the polluter and the developer were clubbered as causers. The developer was called a causer just because they removed tarmac and heavy rainfall washed the soil contamination into the ground. Now, I want to stay on this case for a bit because the time scale is quite phenomenal. The Crest bought the site in the 1980s and cleaned it up. And at the time, they would have thought they've done everything possible. They've discharged planning, they've no further requirements from regulators. Then they sold the site. So they probably thought, good deal, we've made a nice little profit here. But then 19 or 20 years later, the regulators come knocking on the door. First of all, the local authority, this is contaminated land. Then the Environment Agency take over as the enforcing authority. It's a special site. A remediation notice is served on both parties, which is then subject to appeal. Now, there's now been legal enforcement action for 2 decades. And because it hasn't been cleaned up, the water hasn't been cleaned up properly, a second remediation notice has been served. This again has been subject to appeal. Now look at the parties at the end. You've got all these water companies, the site owners, the regulators, think of the law firms and the environmental consultant fees. Now, this is a 30-year liability. And this is one of the reasons why the insurance market is now offering liabilities cap of up to 30 million quid. It's also a good time for me to emphasize the obvious point, whereas if an environmental consultant gives you a reliance letter for 1 million quid, or some people do it to the price of the report, don't get too excited by that. It's not a lot of protection. All of these other mechanisms that I will explain is where you get your protection. Now, you might say, of course, well, I'm not going to deal with a Sandridge case. It's not a chalk aquifer up north we're dealing with, etc. But Part 2A is still being enforced. These are some of the matters that I've been dealing with, and the one at the bottom which is current, is actually a special site. A remediation notice is very unlikely to be served, but it's done by threats. And luckily on this one, we have environmental insurance. So for a £5,000 policy, we're already getting £100,000 back from the insurer. So I'm a big fan of environmental insurance, obviously. Now, what are the contaminated land rules? This is a good place to start. You should all know this because we've had it on the books from the first statutory guidance in 1996. But in simple terms, the causer, the knowing committers, meant to be liable for on-site and off-site contamination. And there's lots of exclusions for the poor innocent owner or occupier. But in reality, it doesn't happen like that, because it's very easy for an owner, an occupier, or a developer to become a Class A knowing permitter. It's very easy with these statutory exclusion tests to take on all the liability of the seller, and even the tenant can end up 100% liable under the lease covenants. Now, in addition to Part 2A, which is causer, knowing permitter, this same dangerous phrase is used in 3 other regimes. The Water Resources Act, which is all about groundwater, surface water remediation. The Environmental Permitting Regs, which is the criminal sort of water pollution breach, again, surface water, groundwater, but also the Environmental Protection Act, waste offences, and Warren will mention later on some of the issues with waste on development sites. Now, the problem with this phrase is case law has given it a very wide interpretation. So the causer can be spills, waste, disturbing the land. This is all to do with the remediation and construction bit, which is actually the main risk, and removing tarmac. But the permitter, the knowing permitter bit, is even more dangerous. It's not just knowledge of an environmental report, the opportunity, the failure to act. There's been a case, Lampson and Merlion, where the court heard basically said, buyer beware. If you get a report, and it could be a phase 1 report that summarizes previous ground investigation reports, you're deemed to have knowledge of all of that information. So it's important to get your hands on those reports to get proper environmental liability advice. So if a developer and all these other parties are caught by this wide knower, knowing permitter and causer definition, you're ending up where everyone really is in the argy-bargy for a fight. Now, my role as an environmental lawyer is to give a client that extra confidence, knowing what the liability is, what the gaps are, and recommending the best protection. With that knowledge, you can come in like this little chap to the left with the blue saber and be in the best position. So that's it, liabilities. Now, how do you transfer them? Now, you can do it by legal or contractual. But the easiest way to explain this is to first of all think of the position of the poor old polluter who's a seller. Now, I've acted for lots of chemical companies who try to get rid of liabilities. Now, they're obviously worried this liability, it's huge. They might have to make a provision in their accounts. It can last for years and years. What they tend to do is throw a lot of money at good environmental consultants to monitor the groundwater to keep the regulators at bay. But at some stage they want to sell, try to get this off their accounts. So they say to their lawyers, give us a clean break. It is not possible to get a complete clean break. In fact, the liability risks actually increase for a seller because a developer comes along, shakes up the ground. You've got a sensitive end receptor. You might have a housing before it might have been industrial. So basically the liability bounces back. That is why you have a Mexican standoff. These chemical companies know that the only proper protection they're going to be getting can be obligations to clean up, environmental insurance. You could have a raft of different layers of protection. So the first bit I'm going to look at is legal transfer. And this is obviously for the benefit of the seller. Now, you'll all be familiar with this top one, sold with information. I've called it the statutory position because even if the contract is silent, this test can apply. There's two limbs to it, providing information or giving permission. And there's lots of bits in the guidance to make it not work that I'll talk about a little bit later. But effectively, to understand the position, both the seller and the buyer are targeted under the contaminated land regime. Then the regulator says who's liable. Well, the buyer takes on all of the seller's liability in addition to its own, and the seller is legally excluded. Now, previous polluters, etc., can also be in the firing line, but we won't go there. My point is, when you're looking at this in contracts, and we all see it in even in long leases and in sale contracts, is despite what is written down, it might not work. So payments for remediation, you see it in loads of brownfield sale contracts. However, it might just say the price has been reduced, so payments for remediation applies. It probably doesn't apply. The guidance say it has to refer to particular remediation. It has to be sufficient to remove this contaminant linkage. So really you need an environmental report to be referred to in that contract. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about, correctly using these exclusion tests. The other one that's often overlooked is test 6. Basically, developers add pathways and receptors through building work. They can also fail to maintain a system that could be monitoring PFAS contamination. It could be problems with the gas membrane. And in Walsall MPC Feed McLean Homes, the polluter was excluded through this test. So this is really getting the seller off the hook. Not great news for the developer. But let's look how it's actually used in practice. So going back to Sandridge, you would think you've got the chemical company, they hand over lots of environmental reports. So sold with information should apply. This is all a Part 2A site anyway. So basically the seller's liabilities as polluter should have passed over, but it didn't. It depends on factual issues. What did the report actually say? The reports actually say, yes, there's bromide contamination in the soil. Crest didn't know so much about the bromate contamination that was in the groundwater. So actually Crest ended up being liable for 55% of bromide, 15% of bromate. So my end message in this is do not rely on the statutory exclusion test. You have no idea how they will eventually be interpreted by a court. A much more useful weapon is an agreement on liabilities. And this is actually good news for a developer because it can basically override the statutory exclusion test in a way, because then it must be applied by the regulators. So it's actually can be more powerful than an indemnity. Now, effectively, any two parties can agree what they want. So a common thing with development projects is a developer saying, yeah, we'll take on-site contamination risks. We'll have to do that anyway through planning, but it's not fair for us to be liable for all of this off-site contamination that's happened for 50 years. You can exclude that, formalize it as an agreement on liabilities, and pretty much the biggest risk of the transaction stays with the seller. Another little tip of this is in a lease, in a sale contract, if you see the expression accept all liabilities under environmental law, just think of red flashing lights, because it brings in all this sort of stuff. It could be asbestos claims, permit requirements, planning, you name it, unlawfully deposited waste. It could be the landfill tax. So my favorite slide, this little cat. Now, cats are meant to have 9 lives. Here's 9 very big risks for a developer, and they'll be lucky to escape all of them. They need protection. Now, one of my first jobs was at Evershed. I was with, sitting right beside the property development team, and they didn't pass work. Well, I was very young at the time, but they didn't pass work to the environment team. And I kind of thought, why is that? Developers have most of the risk. It's a no-brainer. The industry is obviously changing now, and developers seem to use environmental insurance more than ever. So that's the bad news. That's how the legal stuff works. How can we improve the position for developers? Well, on the contractual legal negotiation side with your environmental lawyer, it's important to kind of look at it in 2 columns. The exclusion test and an agreement on liabilities that just says Part 2A, contaminated land regime. It only applies to the contaminated land regime. That could be the last thing to actually be triggered. Going back to one of my first slides that showed you all the types of liability, if you're acting for a seller, you basically want to pass the buck of all of that with a contractual indemnity. So there's 2 different bits to think about. The statutory position is pretty good if a developer gets that. Better if you get an agreement on liabilities, excluding things like off-site migration. But really, it's up for negotiation. Who gets the better deal with the indemnity? Who controls the best insurance? I try to get insurance on the table right at the start, so our client looks better. But things can go wrong. An important part of environmental liability advice, it's not just who's liable, it's what could actually happen. You know, where are the gaps? What could go wrong? Now, the bits in blue are all to do with the legal prescriptive tests in the guidance. You need to print out the guidance and read this. There's lots of things that can go wrong. The seller can retain interest. The buyer can quickly sell or lease. All of this happens in practice. The bits in pink are really the factual things, you know, mobilizing contamination, creating a new liability. Flooding can make it worse. You must have the right scope of works with your consultant. And then some of the stuff at the bottoms with the environmental insurance and indemnities. I've said beware of ELT middlemen. You will get some people popping up now and again saying, don't worry, I'll take all the risks. No, they won't. And of course, you have incorrect drafting because you can be up against all sorts of muppets on the daily. So what would be a very sensible thing to do when you know you've got a high-risk site? Well, this case study sums it up perfectly. A council came to Mills and Reeve and said, we've been offered a remediated site. No, sorry, the university came and we're offered a remediated site from the city council. And can you, Mills and Reeve, get your construction team to check the industry standard warranties and just tell us, you know, what the PI limits are, etc. And that's the end of it. Now, I sat beside the lady that had that instructions and I said, this sounds like a messy site. Offer them an environmental health check. It'd be useful for them to know, actually, is it still contaminated, etc. So at a cut price, they managed to instruct me to do that, but all sorts came up. Looking at the environmental reports, was it cleaned up? No, only 5% had been cleaned up, none of the groundwater. More importantly, or just as importantly, had planning been discharged? No, it hadn't. The contaminated land conditions hadn't, so we had to wait. Then, of course, you had the heads of terms. The university must give an indemnity for everything. Now, when you have the information and the way to say it, you can get around that. We cut out things from the indemnity. And then at the end, after seeing my report, they said, we have to, get internal approval. Is this suitable for purchase? Well, with all the contaminated groundwater, there were still risks, especially because construction hadn't started yet. So we said, actually, no, you need combined insurance. Site pollution liability, contractors pollution liability. That was money very, very well spent. Now, over to Warren, who's going to give some tips on the technical side.
Thanks, Keith. Hopefully everyone can hear me now and I'm not still on mute. So what kind of issues do we need to consider? I think really from our position as environmental consultants, and having worked on transactions for many years, the key thing for me is that clients make some fairly rudimentary mistakes around materiality, and that's our job, and your legal advisor's role really is to try and understand what is material and what's not. When we're looking through a site, where are the issues? And I go back to a well-used phrase that I use regularly with clients, which is there's nothing quite like a site walkover. And you'll see all sorts of different pictures coming up here, many of kind of operational sites, but sites which developers are looking to acquire. It may be a sale and leaseback arrangement. It may be full acquisition, demolition and redevelopment of the site. And if we can move on the slide, what tanks are there? Are there existing staining to the ground? Can we see evidence of poor maintenance? Does that lead us to believe actually we need to do some further investigation to get to the crux of the problem and understand where the liabilities might be in the ground? Next slide, please. And then beyond that, things like drainage, do we understand? It's one thing getting an EnviroCheck or a Groundwater report and seeing that there are sensitive receptors nearby, there's drainage on site. But actually, when you get to site, you often see things like this: poorly maintained drainage, unsealed drainage on a site, drainage that clearly has got pollution in it and is going potentially to surface water. Next slide. And then importantly for developers in particular on brownfield sites, those sites that are left with, in inverted commas, materials, stockpiles of good clean material. The number of times that I heard, we've got a great pile of 6F2 or MLT type 1 that can be used as engineered backfill. That all sounds great on the face of it, but actually, is this a material or is it a waste? Has it been tested? Do we understand the quality of that? And can it both geotechnically and chemically be suitable for use? And that's when all sorts of other areas start to come into play in terms of, is it going to need to be moved off site? If you are going to reuse it, can it be reused under an exemption? Does it need a permit? Can you apply the Clare Code of Practice, also known as the DowCop, for reuse of that material? And each of those come with various different tests, lots of different data that's required, and that should feature as part of your strategy in terms of developing a site, not just to see it as a pile of material that could be reused to develop the site. Next slide, please. And then as we move further on, things like invasive weeds, we've all heard of Japanese knotweed. Anyone involved in brownfield development will be aware of the scourge of Japanese knotweed and how costly it is when you get it wrong. I suppose one of the points to really make here is that there's not much point in visiting a site and saying there's no knotweed there when you're in the dead of winter, because you won't see it flowering. But there are telltale signs, and that's where you need to get the right advisors on site to really kind of pick up on some of those issues. And it's not just the only invasive weed, but we're picking on that in terms of brevity for timing here. Next slide, please. And where do we see the common pitfalls? I would see it in this range of items here. So scope of work. Was there a clear scope of work that was defined at the beginning of the project? Was it pure environment? Did it include health and safety? Do we understand what the end use of that site is going to be, and therefore be able to kind of gear our advice accordingly? Timescales. We're always at the end of a transaction timeline, but invariably, as Keith's alluded to earlier on, these can often be the absolute showstoppers for a site that either means you're attracting too much liability or they become a hard stop in the process and you've wasted time, money and effort. Data, is the right data available? How many data rooms have we seen that just have a long list of documents labeled 1 to 2800, without really referring to what's in there? getting the right advisors, making sure that it isn't just any environmental consultant or any environmental lawyer, but they're the right people for the right kind of sector and the right kind of site. Making sure we communicate properly, making sure reports aren't full of jargon, they're not just written to try and make a consultant look good. There needs to be a non-technical summary that says this is a go, no-go in terms of acquiring the site and where future liabilities might reside, and working with the legal team to look at what future issues might there be in the SPA. Are you looking at an indemnity, which is the legal advisor's role to deal with that, but our job to try and provide information there in terms of what might be considered a significant risk. And then really in red, the biggest issue here that we see is the client just wanted to do the deal. So it doesn't matter what kind of asset it is, buying out the competition, a nice piece of land that you think would really go well in terms of a resi development or mixed use. But the judgment sometimes is clouded by the fact you just wanted to do the deal. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just wanted to finish my little section here around things around a suite of novel chemicals, PFAS. You may have heard terms PFAS and PFOS. It's a novel suite of chemicals that are fairly new in their in terms of manufacture in the last few decades. If you've seen the Mark Ruffalo film Dark Waters, this is a film a little bit like the Aaron Brockovich type story, but around this PFAS contamination. And it isn't just one for the movies. It is a real, genuine concern, and it's something that there's case law on in North America, in Australia. We've worked on projects across Europe related to PFAS. There's existing cases here in the UK as well. My biggest tip for anyone out there at the moment that's looking to acquire sites or develop sites, if you have a site where there is the mere hint that there may have been large stocks of aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, over the years for firefighting. It could be the site was a high-risk environment, an airport, a training ground, a fire station, somewhere where these large stocks of AFFF have been used or stored that may have contained PFAS. Those are high-risk sites and need to be reviewed. So that's one certainly to keep abreast on, but I'm conscious of time there, Keith. I think it's on to you.
Thank you very much, Warren. That was really good. The last thing I want to cover is environmental insurance, because I've mentioned it several times in the webinar so far. Now I've nicked this slide from Remediation, who did the environmental insurance one earlier in the series. With the Brownfield development site, you need a phased approach, and you need both of these types of insurance cover. So from the outset, you would need site pollution liability for off-site migration. This is before any work's done. Then during the works, you need CPL cover, because that's often, as I say, the thing that actually creates the liability. And then after you have sign-off, site pollution liability can be reopened on the site. So then you really have the full suite of cover. Now you can get terms up to 15 years and limits up to 30 million quid. But like everything, it's not the solution completely. There are some significant exclusions. One would be voluntary site investigation. The other one's redevelopment after in the future. The other one could be known pollutant linkages. And I think the industry has a bit of a problem at the minute with PFAS. But my recommendation, go to the experts and get the advice early on. I get one of the ADA environmental insurance policy reports, basically a summary of all the different options and recommendations, and it just looks good in transaction. It gives you the upper hand. So in conclusion, you need layers of protection. I would really stress in every high-risk site to have an environmental legal health check. It really just helps you with tactics, because the environmental lawyer's advice is behind all of these different things. If you do that at the heads of term stage, you can get a better deal. It's much easier to argue an indemnity when it's been agreed in the heads of terms. But to do that, of course, you need the technical advice. On the technical side, I'd recommend a date of appointment, 5 or 10 million pound PI. Then, of course, in the contractual side, depending if you're acting for a developer try to keep it to the statutory position, try to exclude off-site migration in the past and exposure to hazardous substances. If there's permitting issues, there could be an existing permit, or you might need a permit for the development work. Again, you need both legal and contractual advice. And yes, environmental insurance, that is where you get most of your real protection. Now, we have overrun by about 8 minutes. So do you have any questions? Has anything popped up, Warren?
There's a question that was sent separately through, hopefully you can hear me now, around funding for Part 2A sites. In terms of funding that was cut in terms of local authorities pursuing Part 2A cases, how's that affected the market now? You know, what do clients need to be aware of?
Yeah, well, I was very worried about that at the time, because I dealt with lots of Part 2A proceedings, and then it just ground to a halt. Now, as I said earlier in one of the slides, Part 2A is still being enforced by a threat, but I actually think the contaminated land regime plays a phenomenally important part in this whole piece. First of all, it underpins the cleanup standards, so that's 95% of all the remediation done through planning. But also, for what we're talking about today, the negotiations, you have to start with what is the statutory position. That's Part 2A. You need to understand that. You need to argue what's covered, what isn't covered. Once you're in that position of power, you can then bring in the big boys like the indemnities and the insurance. So yeah, really important, really important.
I mean, there is actually another question that's popped through. If a death study identifies some risk, at what point would you recommend intrusive investigation prior to transaction?
Right, that's all tactics. In simple terms, because there's so much risk associated with knowing permitter, if you actually do a phase 2 intrusive, you can increase the liability for your client. If you then buy the site, that liability can last with you. So that is a big risk. However, on the other side, if you know it is a really stinking site, so for example, the one I said where I'm currently doing Part 2A enforcement defense work, there was only a desktop on that. The client wished they would have had done a phase 2, because they would have found out that there had been 15 years of pre-investigations and cleanup by the big bad polluter, etc. So there is a bit of a balancing act, site specific, but generally I'd be very wary before doing a phase 2 unless you have robust legal advice and that's part of the tactics.
Great, thanks for that, Keith. Well, we've still got 8 people on the list, and given the fact we're nearly 10 minutes over, I think that's a great sign that people obviously enjoyed the series of sessions that we've done. And thank you, Keith, for the input there. I think it's probably round about time to maybe try and wrap up. Keith, have you got any last comments that you want to make?
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, it's about getting the right team. Now, if you have an experienced environmental lawyer and consultant, and then, as I say, get Duncan's team involved. If you have that right at the start, you're in the position of power, because with a commercial negotiation, you can be up against all types of people that take ridiculous positions. And it's only when, you have this, the A team on your side that your client will actually feel confident in those discussions. So I hope you've all picked up one or two new points that'll help your own practice in these development projects. But if you do have any questions, please send them across, and we would love to help you and hear from you further. But thank you so much for attending, and have a great day, everybody.